in the blank. You're not getting any younger, so
speak your truth.
Hey you! Yes, you! Welcome to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast, a podcast for people who want to disrupt their lives for a good reason, to make it count. I'm your host, Jen Glantz, and every week I'll drop a new episode with stories from real people just like you, who woke up one morning and decided to make big changes, starting with small things. We'll cover topics like entrepreneurship, love, failure, and self-care. Hey, you're not getting any younger, so let's make this an adventure. Ready? Hey, any youngers. Welcome back to another episode of the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast. It's me, your host, Jen Glantz. What's going on with you this week? I hope you are kicking butt with whatever it is you're trying to do. It's September. We're in a brand new month. One of the best months of 2019, I have to say, no matter where you are. Hopefully that the sun, it's still shining, but the breeze is picking up a little bit more. Maybe the rain is even stopping, and you're feeling good about this month of the year. Let's talk about this week's episode. We have a topic that is so near and dear to my heart in a really tough way to open up about. It's about addiction. And it's something that has touched my life. It's something that I have not personally struggled with, but I have had somebody that I love dearly struggle with it. And it's opened up a whole complete world to me that I never understood before, that I find necessary to share with you in detail, because maybe you're going through it, or someone you know is going through it, or there's somebody in your life who is struggling with addiction and you don't even know about it, and maybe you could be there to help. Today's episode, we have a guest. Not the guest, we have a guest. Her name is Erin Khar, and her book is called Strung Out. It's a memoir about her decade-long battle with opiate addiction, and it explores the very nature of why people do drugs, casting a light on the large opiate crisis, which, if you didn't know, every 11 minutes an American dies of drug overdose. And overdose is the leading cause of death in this country for people under 55 years old. She writes about topics like addiction, recovery, mental health, relationships, and her underlying love for Beverly Hills 90210. You might have read her work in other places like Marie Claire, Self, Esquire, and her weekly advice column, Ask Erin, can be read on the site Ravishly. What I really enjoyed about Erin's book is her honesty. She talks about her struggle as a heroin addict, an opiate addict, and she really opens up about what she's been through and what other people are going through, and how there is such a stigma around addiction. And we have to fight that. We really, really have to fight that as people, because this happened for many years when I lived in New York City, is that I would see people pass it on the street, and I would see people begging for money, and people around me be like, oh, they're just drug addicts, like, leave them alone, like, don't give them money, don't give them this. And it bugs me. It really, really bugs me, because these are human beings who are struggling with something that is, I truly believe, is a mental illness that could happen and can touch anybody. And I've watched it tear apart people in my life. I've watched it destroy people's lives. And I don't want that to happen to you. But if it is happening to you, know that it's okay and that you're not the only person who is struggling with this. And Erin does such a great job of casting a light on that. And our interview today, it's deep, it's rough, it's real, it's honest. And I hope that it helps you. Maybe it could help somebody in your life. This is an episode that maybe you want to send to somebody who is battling addiction, or is a family member or friend of somebody who knows they're struggling with addiction, because getting help is hard, admitting it is hard, and knowing that you're not alone is even harder to believe. I really hope you find something in this episode that can help you or somebody else that you know. Would you describe yourself to a person you just met at a party?
I would say that I'm a writer and a mother and advice columnist. I live in New York City. I write about addiction and recovery, relationships, parenting, infertility, and a whole other gamut of things.
You
I
mentioned, oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you mentioned the advice column, Ask
Mhm.
Erin, which I have
Yes.
been reading for so many years. I get it in my inbox and then I go straight to Ravishly and I read it. Having an advice column is something that a lot of people wish they had, they want to do, but it's not as romantic as you think, right? Like
No.
what is having an advice column like week after week?
Well, I think the hardest part about it is that I'm only answering one question a week. So I get over 100 questions a week.
No
And
way.
yeah, it's the advice column has really grown. I started it in 2009 on my old blog spot. And it was started because I had friends who were joking about how everyone always comes to me for advice. And even in my years when I was like a complete wreck, I still gave pretty decent advice. And I started it there and grew quite a following, and then moved it to Ravishly in 2015, where it's grown exponentially. So the hardest thing is that I feel badly that I can't answer every question. So now, for a while I was doing some like Instagram videos where I'd answer a question. But I think what I'm going to do now is set a couple of times a week where people can pop into stories and ask questions directly there, and I can give short answers because it'll give me a chance to connect with people in another way. So that's probably the hardest part. Also, I think that it's easy to sort of just rattle off your opinion, but I try to be very thoughtful about my answers and very inclusive in terms of differences in religion, in gender, in sexuality, in race, all of those different facets where if something is outside of my experience, sometimes I'll go and ask somebody who does have that experience to lend me a hand in giving some perspective. And I always preface everything by the fact that I'm not a doctor. I'm not I don't work in mental health services. I give advice from like the place that like your friend would give you. So sometimes it's tough love. Sometimes it's, the kind of, I found that usually people come to me already knowing the answer. They just need somebody else to verbalize it for them.
Oh, is that the truth? How good are
Yes.
you at following your own advice, or do you
Oh,
turn to somebody else for advice?
just like anyone, it's much easier to give advice than to take it. But I've gotten better and better at being able to follow my own advice because as I've grown up, and I was definitely a late bloomer in terms of growing up, I learned how to set boundaries and how to advocate for myself and how to prioritize healthy choices, which I didn't for a very long time. And another benefit of, the tagline of the advice column is she's made all the mistakes so you don't have to. I've really made a lot of mistakes in every area of my life. The beauty of making mistakes is that if you are willing to look at yourself and to look at your part in things, you learn like these invaluable life lessons that you can only really learn through making mistakes. So I feel very grateful for having made all those mistakes because now it's allowed me to make better and better decisions the older I've become.
I have so many questions about your story, but the topic of mistakes is something I do want to touch on a little bit more.
Mhm.
There are people listening right now who are in the height of their mistake. They're currently
Right.
making it, or they're suddenly realizing they made it, and now they're not feeling so great about themselves. And you have made, like you said, so many mistakes. You've had quite the story, and you come out of it, and you use the word grateful. So, what
Mhm.
advice do you have for people who are stuck inside of this mistake, or just feeling like shit about their mistake, to let them know how life could turn out for them?
I think that the biggest driving factor for people not being able to get out of a bad situation, whether it's an addiction or an abusive relationship or a toxic work situation or really unhealthy family dynamics, I think that what keeps people from getting out is shame. We have such a fear of other people discovering that we've made the mistake that we stay in the mistake pretending it's not happening. I think that that's a really common human experience. And I think that for me, the moment that I was willing to be very honest, first with myself and then with everybody in my life, that was the way that the shame started to dissipate. The shame was like this giant monster lurking in the corner. And when I was finally able to face it, it started to disappear. And it's hard to have faith in that when you're in the thick of it. But with every single challenging situation in my life, the minute that I was able to be honest about it was when things started to change.
And you really faced this head on. Your new memoir is called Strung Out, One Last Hit and Other Lies That Nearly Killed Me. Okay, I got this book. I couldn't put it down. I read it in less than a day. I took it with me to the mall because, it was, and it's a book that I even posted on Instagram. You saw, I highlighted, I folded pages down. The book is a mess because I just really took to it. And the book is a deeply personal and extremely raw account of your 15-year struggle with opiate addiction,
yes,
which is something that we're going to talk about. It's so common, but nobody is talking about it. I mean, you could know a person who is currently struggling with it and have absolutely no idea. So what was the moment in your life where you decided you wanted to come forward and be honest with your story to the entire world?
When I first started writing, and writing was like a career change for me, which I write about in the book as well, I sort of shifted paths and started writing. And as I started writing my advice column and started writing essays and articles, I started getting more and more personal. And when I did start to open up about some of my struggles, the response was really overwhelming from people. And I began to sort of realize that I had been honest in my personal life, and I had come to the place where everyone that knew me in real life knew about my past and everything. But I realized that the more that I spoke about it, the more people reached out to me, and I realized that I had an opportunity to really open that conversation up. And, there are plenty of addiction memoirs in the world. There are not as many by women, and there are certainly very few by female opiate and heroin addicts. And because, when I was using, there weren't as many young women in my demographic that were in active heroin addiction. Now, because of the boom in opioid addiction, that demographic has changed, and use among young women is up exponentially. And I really wanted to write something where I talked about my personal experience and also talk about it in a way that got behind the psychology of addiction, got behind the ways in which shame, particularly for young women, plays into addiction. And I wanted to open that all up so that it would be eye-opening, not just for people that might be struggling or for people who care about someone who's struggling, but also for people who don't think that they know anyone that's ever had an addiction, or they feel like they don't understand it. How could you ever do that? I wanted people like that to be able to read the book and recognize the humanity that exists within addiction, and that it's, unfortunately, it is a human experience, and that the motivations behind addiction and that the psychology behind addiction is something that's relatable to people, even if they've never been addicted to anything.
Absolutely. And I think it's important. I really want us to educate the audience listening right now about the opioid crisis that's happening. And you wrote this in page 2 of the book, is every 11 minutes an American dies of a drug overdose. That's every 11 minutes. It's the common cause of death in this country for people under 55. And when I tell people that, they're like, oh no, that can't be true. Isn't it cancer? And I'm like, no, this is a real thing happening. So could you briefly educate us on why this is becoming such an epidemic, and why suddenly, for the first time in so many years, it's all over the news and people are talking about this?
I mean, look, it's in the news because it started affecting middle-class white people.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, they're definitely, this is, addiction is not something that is by any means new, but I think that there were perceptions during the crack epidemic that it was vastly affecting people of color and people in certain socioeconomic status. And as the opioid crisis grew and started affecting predominantly white middle-class communities, the news was responding more. So you have that factor. But there is also the factor that because of a lot of people being led to opioid addiction through prescription medication, there was a boom in the amount of people addicted to opiates. You know, heroin is such a stigmatized drug, right? I mean, and so many people like that I knew, even when I went to rehab the first time, you know, I was the youngest person there by 10 years. I was one of 3 women out of like 30 inpatients, and I was the only heroin addict. Now, if you walked into a rehab, that would be very different. But the thing that I heard from people repeatedly was, oh yeah, you know, like I would never touch heroin. That's the one thing I would never do. But because people are now being introduced to opiates through prescription drugs, they end up in a situation where it's a lot easier and cheaper to get heroin than it is to get pills. You know, that said, I don't think we can blame the entirety of the opioid crisis on pharmaceutical companies or the medical community. And I know that a lot of people hold them accountable for this. I'm not saying that they don't have any part in it, but there are plenty of people that are prescribed opioids for pain that do not become addicted, even if they're on them so long they have a slight physical dependence and have to be weaned down off of them because they have chronic pain. There are many people that don't become addicted. So what's the difference between somebody that becomes addicted and somebody that doesn't? And from everything that I understand as a lay person, I'm not a doctor or scientist, but from what I understand and from what I've witnessed and experienced, the difference is that there is a mental health component where certain people finally find some relief that they have been missing their entire life. That's how it was for me. I was trying to treat an emotional and mental pain with something that was made for physical pain.
Yeah.
So I think that that's, you know, I think that the influx of drugs has created the opportunity, but I think that as a country, we're not that healthy mentally and emotionally.
No.
There's a lot of ways we could point to that, and I think that as that our culture and our political landscape becomes even more divisive, that adds to it. This doesn't feel like a happy time in America.
No, absolutely. No,
yeah.
You're right. And I think, is addiction classified as a mental illness? Because is it?
Yes.
Because it is. Okay. Because it absolutely should be. And I think the thing that I also took to in the beginning of your story is so many people would ask why someone like you would turn to drugs in the first place, and whether it's someone turning to drugs or even somebody having a sip of alcohol and then becoming addicted to alcohol, or the same thing with anything. Can you explain how you could answer a question like that when someone would say, why would someone like you who had a seemingly great life try to do drugs in the first place?
I mean, I reached for drugs because I wanted to kill myself. I had that impulse to kill myself from a really young age. And part of that, I had some childhood trauma. I had some sexual abuse when I was young that I hid from my family. So I had that going. I had this, trauma, this core trauma, and then some underlying mental health issues. And I had such an overwhelming feeling that I wanted to harm myself that in some way, I've often said like heroin like saved me because it stopped me from killing myself directly. Sure, it was killing me in a slower way, but I reached for drugs because the alternative to me was jumping out the window. And I think that there are a lot of people, particularly with opiates, that end up using them or misusing them because they are in emotional and mental pain. And I think that our mental health, to me, our mental health services are as important as having universal health care. I put that under the same umbrella. We have really poor access to mental health services for people in this country. I was really, really fortunate that I was able to access mental health services when I, finally was able to stay stopped. I was able then to do the work through therapy and with, seeing a psychiatrist. I had access to those things. And a lot of people, the majority of people don't. because it's cost prohibitive. Because even if you have insurance, your insurance only covers so much or so many therapy sessions. And I think that you'd find that a lot of opiate addicts have childhood trauma, whether it's classic PTSD or like a complex PTSD from some sort of neglect, coupled with some underlying mental health issue, be that bipolar disorder or depression or borderline personality disorder, or, any number of things, anxiety, there's a whole gamut of things. There's all of these factors. And that's why I think that it's not as simple as saying, oh, somebody is, when we look at like a disease model, which is sort of traditionally like from a 12-step program perspective, I don't know that that's not really a one-size-fits-all treatment for people, because there are all of these other factors that need to be addressed, and those are all under sort of a healthcare umbrella.
Oh, this is the topic that gets my blood boiling. It's 2019 and people still don't have access to mental health care, and they have to, like even I wanted to start going to a therapist a couple of years ago. I have pretty bad insurance, but still I can pay for insurance. It would have cost me $200 an hour to see a therapist, and it was ridiculous. And for a while, I resisted because I can't afford that. And I was able to find, another way of getting help, but it is just so unfortunate that this is not something that is offered for free to people. Oh yeah, we could go on forever. But, it's just
and it bleeds into so many other areas too. So it's definitely, when I look at like sort of like how do we approach the opioid crisis in this country, I think that it's through a model of like harm reduction services to give people a destigmatized pathway to help, and having adequate help there for people. Because the goal should be that we want people to be able to live and support themselves and be productive members of society. Happy, healthy people aren't addicted to drugs. That's just a fact.
I think one side of the story is the people around those that are the addict. And I think, a big question that I'm always curious about is what kind of help can they give? Because, I mentioned a little bit about my story. I've experienced this personally with a loved one. And luckily, when we found out about the addiction, the loved one was ready for the help. But, living in New York City, I mean, you see this all over the streets. And you see people passed out, and you see people begging for money. And, it killed me the other day. I was walking in Penn Station up the stairs, and there was somebody passed out, definitely on drugs, passed out in the middle of the staircase. And people are just like, God, couldn't they find another place to sleep? And I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I didn't know what to do, but I just knew that, like, A, they were not educated, and B, they didn't understand. And then C, I wonder, what kind of help can we give people? Do people who are struggling with addiction want help from those around them? And I would love to hear your response on that.
Well, I mean, certainly not. Not everyone is going to be open to help. Part of the reason that I'm such a proponent of harm reduction services is that I believe that by offering people like a needle exchange program, access and training for Narcan, safe injection sites, I think all of those are a way of destigmatizing addiction. It's giving people a sense that they are still being treated as like human beings. And, I think that when I first went to rehab, and like sort of my experience with recovery, and sort of the go-to was like more of like a hard line sort of tough love. And my parents weren't necessarily great at that, but I sort of felt that way because I also had friends that were struggling, and I'd be sober and they were struggling. And there was very much this sort of like tough love model. And I don't really feel that way as much anymore. That's not to say that you don't set boundaries with people, but I believe that there needs to be a connection maintained so that they know that they still have connections to family and friends, because the more disconnected a person is from society and from social structures, the less likely they are to get help. So, I have a friend that runs a really fantastic nonprofit in Los Angeles, which is a harm reduction program, and they do needle exchange and Narcan training and also offer pathways for people to get on things like Suboxone and some pathways to get into housing and treatment programs, but that's not pushed on them. The people that do access those services after some time have a really high success rate because they trust that the agency that's there is not there to shame them or to dehumanize them. They are just there to help keep them alive. So I think that that's really, really, really important. And I think that with our interpersonal relationships, keeping that door open to people, is important. It's why like shows like Intervention, I saw, I have very queasy feelings about them. And I understand it because that's sort of the model we've had for a long time. But I don't know that it's the best way to get somebody help.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting thing to say because people who are not in this world, maybe have not been through it or don't have a loved one in this world or a friend or a family member, they think there's just one path. You sit a person down, you say, enough, go to rehab, you're done. And, you say it. Like, most people go to rehab more than one time. This is not something that is very easy. One of my favorite quotes in this book is that addiction spares no one. Make no mistake. Making it out is akin to winning the lottery. Even if you have the best resources and access for help, it is a journey.
Yes.
And your journey ended when you were pregnant with your son. So can you tell us about what happened in that moment where you said, I'm done?
I don't know that it was so much a moment that I thought I was done. I knew that when I decided, I was still actively using. When I found out I was pregnant, I decided that I wanted to have the baby. But I was not sure if I would stay stopped. I found a doctor that would detox me with buprenorphine because I didn't want to go on methadone. I had never been on methadone, and I didn't want to choose that path for me or for my child. I wasn't sure if I was going to stay stopped when he was born. I didn't feel that connected. I had a really difficult pregnancy. I was in an unhappy marriage. And when he was born, it sounds trite, but I looked at him and I just felt like, oh my God, I love this baby more than I could ever hate myself. And it was for me like a switch flipped. That's not how I stayed sober, but I knew that I had to do everything I could to stay off of drugs because I didn't want to do that to this little being whom I loved so much. So it gave me that impetus to then do all the work that I had to do to really recover, because getting off of drugs is just a small part of it. I had years and years of unhealthy behavior that I had to unlearn and healthy behavior to relearn. And that was really what did it for me. And that's why I do feel like I won the lottery. It doesn't happen for everyone when they have children. I don't know why it happened for me. I do feel like part of it is luck. And I feel like part of it is that, when I made that decision, I then had the privilege of being able to access mental health care because that was a huge component for me. It was really at the crux of everything for me. So it was those sort of like combination of things, like this one thing that sort of set me off, my son being born, and then really digging in and doing the work and having the access to the help.
Yeah, and it's such a beautiful way you write this book because you start off with the question that your son asks you of, Mom, have you ever done drugs? And then you go and the book tells your entire story, which I can't recommend this book enough to everyone, whether or not this is a topic close to your heart or you know nothing about it. I think this is a book that will educate you, but also show you the reality of a human being's story. And it's just beautiful how it does come together at the end where you do open up and you share your story with your son. And
right.
I think one of the other interesting points toward the end of the book is, I think you write this in the end, is someone asks you, Erin, like, why don't you just want to leave this mess behind you? Like, why do you want to write it in a book? And I just think that your response was beautiful. So I want you to share that. I know people out there have their own struggle, their own issues, their own thing, and they're scared to tell their story. And people are saying that same thing to them. Just leave the mess behind you.
Right.
Why did you do it? Why'd you write this story?
Well, as I had said earlier, I think that as I started sharing pieces of my story, I realized how people responded to it. And I thought about all of the books and music and art that had moved me, over the course of my lifetime. And I think that when we write from that sort of like honest place about a human experience, that's what makes art really valuable, is seeing a human experience reflected back at me. And, there's sort of like the tagline of Ravishly where Ask Erin lives, and it's sort of a motto for me in everything that I do as a writer, is that I want everything I create to make people feel less alone. And in doing so, the gift to me is that I also feel less alone. So I think that that's a really beautiful way to sort of take all of these failures and mistakes of the past, consolidate them into a narrative, and then present it to the world, because it connects us when we see our experiences, even if they're not exactly the same, the experiences of like loneliness or despair or triumph, or all the different variations that we may go through in a lifetime. When we see them reflected in a song or a book or a painting, it does something to us. That's why art is so important, right? It moves, it stirs something in our soul because we feel that connection to other humans.
Absolutely. And Erin, thank you so much for writing this book and for sharing your story with us. I want to end with the question that we end all these interviews with. Fill in the blank. You're not getting any younger, so
speak your truth.
Amen to that. Erin, please tell our listeners where they can find out more about you, your book, and also the Ask Erin column.
Sure. So you can find out about me, my book, upcoming appearances, all of that good stuff on my website, which is erinkhar.com. And my weekly advice column, Ask Erin, is up every Wednesday on ravishly.com.
Wow. Thank you so much, Erin. I really, really, really appreciate you coming on here, sharing your truth with us today. Hey, you. Thank you for listening to the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast. There are hundreds of thousands of pods out there, so thank you for listening to this one. You can find the show notes for this week's episode up on our website, anyyounger.com. Subscribe, rate, and review the You're Not Getting Any Younger podcast on iTunes so that other ears around the world can listen too. Oh, and join our secret You're Not Getting Any Younger Facebook group, where over 1,000 people are talking about how to disrupt their lives, for good reason, to make it count. Until next week, all my love, Jen Glantz.